Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is the program that brings you news, views, discussion, updates and analysis of religious liberty events in the United States and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty magazine, and my guest on this program is attorney Allen Reinach. You're executive director of the
Church State Council.
Last time I
celebrating
I thought,
our 50th anniversary in 2014.
We worked very closely together. I was going to say I'm an Australian, but that's really a misleading thing. I've lived most of my life in the United States, but here we're in the US talking in that context. But let me invoke another country, the British parliamentary system. I don't know about you, but I love to listen to the BBC and some of the question time in Parliament and the raucous bantering and desperate comments that sometimes come from the Prime Minister are quite entertaining. I haven't generally seen anything like that in the United States, right?
Okay.
But lately, a little bit. Think back to, I think it was President Obama's first State of the Union message. You remember that? As I remember, he stepped out of line of protocol. It's usually very prim and proper in the United States. And he took the time to rail against a recent Supreme Court decision.
Okay.
Citizens United.
Indeed.
I mean, that was quite out of character. I can't remember anything quite like that. They often get on a hobby horse about the Cold War or whatever, these presidents. Mm-hmm. But to take a shot across the bow of domestic, in this case, domestic political situation, the Supreme Court, was something else. And then Chief Justice Roberts grimaced and was murmuring things, and then later
shaking his head.
they went on the warpath. So that in its own way, I think, is as untoward as any of the yelling and screaming and the backbencher cawing and jabbering like apes in England. What's going on?
The Supreme Court decision that most, if you ask Christians, you know, what cases do you remember are notable cases? They may say, for example, Roe v. Wade, the case that legalized abortion. Yeah. But Citizens United is probably the single worst case of the last century.
And
why?
The boldest departure from a previous understanding.
It essentially equates money and speech in terms of the political process, and it gives, you know, the rights of a person, personhood.
Didn't it say corporations are individuals too?
Well, for purposes of making campaign donations. Yeah. So, you know, now we have to wonder, when you go out and spend your money at the store, where a portion, you know, which political party a portion of that's going to go to support, or which candidates, because corporations are now virtually unrestrained. Now, Citizens United was the first of a couple of cases. There's one pending now before the court that may go the next step. Citizens United did not say that corporations can give or to candidates directly, but to political action committees that essentially support candidates and, for all intents and purposes, are directed by the candidates.
Right, and there's no cap on what they can spend, unlike, wasn't it McCain, who was his co-sponsor? On the McCain, was it Feingold? Yeah. McCain-Feingold years ago.
Well, that's what was struck down by Citizens United.
Yeah, but there's still limits. You and I couldn't give. Not that we're political, not at all.
That's the next case that's likely to fall.
There's a very, very low limit on what you can give for a campaign contribution, even if you're a billionaire.
Right. But that's the next case that's coming along, and that's likely to fall. So that essentially now we have government. Oh, well, it was the comedian's quip that it's finally true now that corporations are persons, that we have government of, by, and for the people.
Well, it's I mean, it's funny, but it's sad.
That was Stephen Colbert's quip.
But it does have the ability or the potential to subvert this perfect union.
Well, the idea that our elected officials are responsive to their constituents is less and less true when the corporations become the single most significant part of campaign finance.
Now, I don't claim, I mean, sometimes in our discussions we claim to be sort of in the mind box of the Supreme Court justices. I don't really, how could I know what they think? But it appears to me that as very often they're very bookish types and they study back, that in a perverse way they've come close to the principles that underlay the founding of the United States. You know, that classic statement that we say, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was actually originally in
life, liberty, and property.
Property.
Yeah.
And I think, but I think it's very dangerous. They're going back to origins and are equating political power and the ultimate thing that this whole governance protects is property and aggregations of property. So that's where they've gotten this wonderful new respect for a corporation.
Look, if you want to go back to our founding fathers, James Madison wrote later in life collection of thoughts about separation of church and state.
Detached memoranda.
Detached memoranda is what it's been come to be called. And in it, he was very suspect of treating the church as a corporate entity and the potential for the church to gain money and power and property because of its continued existence.
Which was a standard Protestant viewpoint.
Well, because you look at Catholicism...
That was the fight of the Reformation, apart from doctrine. That was it in a nutshell.
Sure. So what's ironic about Madison's concerns so long ago is how it has come true with respect not to the religious corporation, but the secular corporation, and just how much power the corporate world has obtained in this country.
But in other discussions, we've pointed out that the individual is progressively losing the right to stand up for their individual conscience. Mm-hmm. There are larger issues, and I even throw in the common good and so on. And so the Citizens United, not the Bible, the Citizens United case, I think is just another part of the dynamic heading us away from the autonomy and rights and conscience of the individual.
Well, you know,
corporatism.
What's interesting when you look, and I want to bring this back to prophecy here, because that's really our purpose in criticizing the global economy and the masters of it, is to see that the Bible actually has something to say that in the last days there is, shall I put it, a counterfeit trinity of the political powers, the economic powers, and the religious powers all in bed together. And it's all going to come crashing down, but not before the three together unite to restrict liberty of conscience.
Yeah, read those texts. That we were looking at them a little early.
Well,
I remember quoting a couple of these texts during the economic collapse of 2008.
James really talks of, you know, to me, this is a forerunner of how we have virtual slave labor and child labor producing our goods in Southeast Asia, while we want to go to our big box stores, which I won't call out by name, but you know, we want to buy cheap goods. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. So James clearly it's his end time. Prediction. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. Capital has been very oppressive of labor. We are destroying the middle class. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. And James goes on again in the last days context, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord.
Yeah. But so
that's one.
Economic inequality is a characteristic of our end time.
Oh, and we have the worst inequality.
You know, there was the Bhopal incident. It wasn't in Pakistan. In Bangladesh, this building collapsed, killing hundreds of these marginal workers. And I can remember, my wife is from Guatemala, going to an upscale shirt factory there. It was Yves Saint Laurent, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You know how much they pay the owner of the factory to assemble a shirt?
Nothing.
25 cents a shirt.
Yeah, no.
And he's doing well.
The fact
So
that
the workers there are getting nothing.
Yeah, no, it's outrageous. Revelation 18. The merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. And goes on for verses about the collapse of the economy.
And they lament that in 1 hour, this great
this
economic edifice collapses.
Right, Babylon comes crashing down.
And in this regard, I think Babylon stands for just the confusion of man's ways, all of these false systems.
But we have a threefold counterfeit trinity, the religious powers, the civil powers, and the economic powers, all in this confused global order, if you will, and very oppressive of the rights of individuals, and especially the rights of conscience and religious freedom.
Now, what can Christians do about this? I often have people, when I explain religious liberty, but what can we do about it? Probably not much, right? But we're certainly not called upon to be social revolutionaries in the sense of taking up any sort of a vendetta against authority in the system. But I think we're to have a loud prophetic voice, and that we shouldn't suffer these things quietly. We should speak true principles against this developing construct.
Let me first of all say what we should not do. We should not have an attitude of passivity and inevitability. Oh, well, you know, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, there's nothing I can do about it, and not to vote and just to disengage. Yes, the old saying goes, think global and act local. So, for starters, we do need to pay attention to what goes on in our own communities. We need to participate. We need to provide leadership. Right. Revelation says, God says, I will destroy those who destroy the earth. We need to examine our own lifestyles and take baby steps, maybe concrete, to have less of an impact
and the baby steps
on the economy, on the environment.
Don't you agree? The baby steps are not because they will change the world, but the baby steps should be because we're babies following Christ. We're called to follow and exemplify Christian and biblical principles, and it's really up to God as to whether that will change the world or not, but we have to be changed. We have to act correctly.
We need to live thoughtful, moral lives and to lead by example.
We can't just opt out. I remember it was a Seventh Adventist leader in Australia at one of the publishing houses I worked at, and his view was, well, it's all going to go down the tube, so I'm going to irresponsibly borrow heavily here because I'll never have to pay it back.
Back in the Reagan,
so out there.
Back in the Reagan era, we had an Interior Secretary by the name of James Watt, who was an evangelical. I think it was a Pentecostal. I
remember him.
And he wanted to drill excessively for oil off the coast of California. And to the environmental concerns, he said, Jesus is coming soon, it doesn't matter.
Well, we're laughing about it, but in another context, that's more than just a personal mistake. That's part of the philosophy of the dominionists. It's a God-given right to plunder the earth because it's for ours to take.
But we're not called to be stewards.
Right. It's different than stewardship, rather. Dominionist is a control. Well, we're not given control. We're given custody. There's a difference. We could continue, but I think it's time for a break. So we'll be back in a few minutes. Please to Liberty Insider. Before the break with guest Allen Reinach, we were talking, initially we started off talking about the Citizens United case that has really empowered corporations essentially as individuals and changed the whole electoral process, or not the electoral, but the process building up to an election, fundraising and so on.
And I want to come back to Citizens United, Lincoln, because there was one particular conservative who donated $60 million to try to get Mitt Romney elected president. And obviously, it didn't work. And so people are tended to be lulled into a sense of false security as though Citizens United is not going to be a game changer. Where it's a game changer is at the congressional elections, at local elections. Congressmen are being cowed into submission by the threat of $3 million is what it takes to unseat a congressman. And there are plenty of millionaires and plenty of corporations that would not blink at spending
Well, we've already
$3
seen the game changer. It's a corrupting influence.
Very much
the type of, swift boating, I mean, it's become a term in the language,
Right.
swift boating.
Well,
I
and
don't
there's
think
one
that sort of thing
conservative-
would happen without this phenomenon.
There's one conservative industrialist family that's well known that has started to implement a strategy of reshaping the Republican Party according to the Tea Party. And we've seen the dire impact that that has had in bringing Congress to its knees. Congress is almost completely dysfunctional because it is no longer a place of compromise. If it's a place of ideological purity, nothing's going to get done.
Let me, I mean, I don't know what you likely respond to this, but there's not a direct parallel between modern Pax, well not Pax, but the Pax Americana and the system of empire, pseudo-empire that America represents, and the Roman Empire. But you're talking about Congress. There was a corruption of the power of the Senate in Rome. What, do you remember your history? What, well, didn't that dysfunction lead directly to autocracy?
Well, we have had the accumulation of executive power, the imperial presidency. We've been writing about it at least since the 1960s. But, for all the conservatives that like to criticize Obama's use of power, he inherited it, as it were.
Yeah.
If you have it, you're going to use it.
And that was
using
true with
drones,
with Rome too.
Using drones as a primary instrument of the war on terror, as a substitute for sending boots on the ground. Yeah, killing American citizens with the use of drones without due process of law, which has taken place under this administration.
Unless I'm forgetting some of my Roman history, there was a shift within the Senate. It was always the aristocracy, if you like. But I think it became consciously the wealthy families represented there, the oligarchs of Rome, and that removed them from the people, because it was always meant to represent the people. And once that happened, they became dysfunctional, because it was like the Montagues and the Capulets, to pick another illustration from Italy. And no, I don't believe these, I'm not suggesting parallels are direct, because what really we were seeing working through Rome and now today, it's human nature, how it works out.
Look,
and self-interest.
The reality is we have an increasing divide between the 1% and the 99. And the fact is the mega rich and the corporations are increasingly dominating our political policies and our debates and shaping the politics for the nation. And those policies are not necessarily in your best interests and mine and those of the listeners. I believe the TARP program, for example, was necessary. Did we need to pump liquidity into the banking system to keep it from collapsing? Yes. But did we need to do more than that? Did we need to pump liquidity into Main Street and do something to help Main Street recover? There is a reason why 5 years later, we're nowhere close to the level of employment that we had before the collapse, and the economy is limping along. It's because of policies that have been kowtowing to Wall Street.
Back to our text. How now you're wealthy because you've held it back by fraud. I mean, political developments, countries can do them right or wrong, but what at root here, I think, is a changed attitude toward fellow man, and a Christian religious sensibility is a moderating force and an equalizing force, and that's being withdrawn, literally. You and I believe this, and the Bible indicates that at the very end of Earth's history, God will no longer strive with men. His Spirit will no longer strive. So we're now more and more under the natural inclinations of people, and there's more people that haven't accepted God or a higher power, and so these things follow through to their logical end, which is despotism. It's unconcern for the common person, the poor.
People often ask me, Lincoln, because I do a whole series on the coming economic collapse from a biblical perspective. And they ask me if, what's going to bring this about? And of course, the Bible doesn't tell us, and I don't have a crystal ball, but I'll take a lesson from the example of Greece. Greece is continuing to be a drag on the European Union. And I asked my brother, who's, I'm the first in 3 generations to leave Wall Street. My whole family has been in Wall Street for 3 generations. And he's a trader. I said, how is it that a 23rd rate economy can have such a dire impact on global markets? Well, it's because of centralization. It's because of globalization. The reason that we have the potential for the kind of global economic collapse that Revelation portrays is because of this consolidation, this globalization that is tying everything up into a nice, neat bundle that can burn with one flashpoint.
You must have been reading Ellen White, one of the pioneers.
Binding in bundles to be burned.
Seventh-day Adventist Church pioneer and a visionary, Ellen White. She made that comment about the end of time, that she used confederacies.
Yes.
Confederacies of business, confederacies of ideology, they're uniting. And we've seen, the takeovers in business, the European Union collecting countries when the Soviet Union collapsed. It seems to be the spirit of the times.
Right.
And yes, we see it in a prophetic sense, but it's clearly happening before everyone's eyes.
It is.
And I'm surprised that it's happening, because apart from anything else, I thought, I studied this, that the lesson of World War I was that these bundles led directly to World War I.
Right.
It's a bad phenomenon.
That's exactly
it's sort
right.
of all or nothing. We all go down together.
Right. So if there's one thing, though, rather than take a passive attitude or, a fatalistic attitude, there's nothing I can do. For starters, the role of the church is to be prophetic, not priestly. The priesthood is part of the establishment, part of the status quo, and helps to maintain the social order. The prophets are apart from the social order, and they are to call the society to a higher level. Now, if we as a church are going to call for repentance, call for revival, call for a higher standard of moral living, then our footprint, our carbon footprint has to be reduced. Our, consuming the products of slave labor, we have to think twice about what products we're buying and who's making them. We have to start
investments
we have to start applying morality to the decisions of our everyday life, and then we have the courage to talk about how morality influences all of our decisions in life. And it's not just about, the issues, for example, of sexuality that are the things that the church is
you're right.
publicly
We need to be morally consistent,
about.
is what you're saying.
Right.
And also, when you say prophetic, that's not to condemn the world, but to call the world to answer to a higher authority and put them on their best behavior, right?
Well,
and that the Lord, there's a Lord that expects them to behave differently.
That is, every generation, the prophets and the preachers have decried the moral decline of the age.
Unfortunately, Jesus says, which of the prophets haven't you killed or persecuted? So it's not always in itself you're not thanked in your own time, but it still needs to be done correctly. I don't think when we say prophetic, it can't be good to just sort of lash out at the world, but call it to a higher calling.
But it is a myth that too many Christians have that somehow the free market is biblical or Christian. The free market is built on greed. There's that famous Michael Douglas line in the movie where he says, in the sequel, he says, "I used to say that greed is good. Now it appears to be legal." Well, Christians should not be endorsing a system of greed. We should be speaking a prophetic voice to a higher moral agenda when it comes to the economy and concern for our fellow man.
Confederations have an interesting history. In prehistory, there's the story of Nimrod, the hunter, and his leadership in what became Babylon. There's the association of Nimrod with the Tower of Babel and man's efforts to challenge God himself by building a great edifice. That was over when God dispersed man. But when I look at the other side of the biblical story, in Revelation, it tells there that when all of man's worst endeavors are put to an end, when the earth is cleansed and ready for a new beginning, God's eternal holy city comes down and descends to the earth itself. It's several miles on a side. It's massive, bigger than the Tower of Babel. And there God's people look down on the wicked who confederate again for the last time against God and his principle. We need to realize that man, in his own inclination, really doesn't work for a godly end. We need to realize that God's people have the ability, the opportunity to unite themselves with him for ultimate freedom, for ultimate security, and an ultimate solution to the confederations of evil men. This is Lincoln Steed for Liberty Insider.